the beautiful Carmelite nuns in Mathaura, a friend of mine said, "Oh, do you know what time they're starting Vespers now?" I said, "Oh, I thought it was 5:10." And my friend said, "Oh no, they've adapted it to be a little bit more seasonal. At the screeching of the cockatoos flying overhead, one of the sisters will ring the bell, and within 5 minutes they will begin Vespers."
G'day everyone, welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makowiecki and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Ronan Reilly. Ronan is a sacred musician working in Sydney, New South Wales. Ronan, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So Ronan, I understand you don't live in Sydney, you commute there. Could you tell us a bit more about where your residence is?
Yeah, so we've moved around a few years. My wife and I, Beatrice, we've been married 7 years. We started out in Brisbane, where my wife grew up after moving from Mauritius, and I taught in a school up there for 5-6 years. Then we moved down south post-COVID for a number of reasons, took up a job in Melbourne for a while, and now we have very happily ensconced ourselves in Mathaura, which is 3 hours north of Melbourne and 3 hours west of Wagga, so a fair way out, and probably a place more well-known slightly north of us is Deniliquin. So we're living on a 9-acre property there with the 4 children and a few pigs.
And you and I think we go back to probably 2008 from memory. But what I'd like to do is go back to 2002 when you joined the St. Mary's Cathedral Choir as a boy. Could you tell us more about the training you received and the commitment it required, just for those who don't know what it involves?
Yeah. So I started out as a 10-year-old, auditioned when I was 9 in 2001. And at the time, basically knew very little or almost nothing about sacred music or even religious music of any sort. I grew up in a very musical family, both parents being from Ireland, and mum and dad both singing, mum more so, and dad at least at some point playing the accordion and other instruments. So I definitely came from a musical background, but the sacred music scene was completely new to me. But fortunate for us, we had to, as part of the scholarship program, we would turn up Monday to Friday at the cathedral itself, not the college, at the cathedral choir rooms from, I think it was about 7:45, possibly 8, for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. And that was every morning of school during the term time. And then, of course, on Sunday mornings, we were there again, 9 o'clock rehearsal for a 10:30 mass, finished around 12:30. So a fair commitment. And then as part of that scholarship program, we also had to learn for the first 2 years a stringed instrument, which was to help with the ear and tuning and such. So I think I calculated at some stage it was about 5,000 hours of rehearsal and liturgy time between year 5 and year 12. So pretty intense program.
Yeah, I think it's probably underestimated the kind of work you put in, because people think of athletes and, they get up at crazy hours of the morning. But I don't think they have a proper appreciation for what goes into other artistic gifts. Yeah, well, it obviously shows, because Sydney has long had a strong musical tradition, well, in the Archdiocese at least. And I was surprised when I was researching you had quite a breadth of knowledge about the history of sacred music in Sydney. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, my interests in kind of Sydney Archdiocesan Catholic history began almost accidentally in the surrounds of the cathedral, both the college, the cathedral house where the archbishops live, or have since, I think, the 1970s when it was built, and of course the cathedral itself and the crypt, being a particularly beautiful place where many of the archbishops and cardinals of Sydney now rest. And the 4 sports houses of the Cathedral College were named after the first 4 archbishops of Sydney. And I was in the Polding House. So from year 5, little 10-year-old, there was this idea of Paulding in my head, but I didn't really know anything about him at all. But as time went by, I would discover things again by accident, looking at the stained glass windows around the cathedral, different stories that we were told by teachers or choir staff. We were all given a really excellent chorister's manual when we began at the cathedral choir as well, and that was jam-packed with information that we didn't really appreciate at the time, but looking back at it and reading over it over the years, and even since leaving the choir, I've learnt more yet. But Archbishop John Bede Paulding, he was 82 when he died and spent 41 years in England and 41 in Australia. So kind of a half life. And he himself was a Benedictine monk. His maternal uncle was the head of the English Benedictine congregation growing up, and both his parents died when he was young. He went into his uncle's care, and I believe he joined the order officially at about 13, maybe 14 or 15, so he was very young. He went on to become the novice master, so was obviously steeped in the Benedictine tradition, in monasticism, in sung prayer, and in the patristics and scripture, so on. And before he even knew that he was going to go to Australia as the ordinary, or much wider diocese at the time, all of Oceania and even Mauritius for a year or so, he taught the future Archbishop Vaughan. So his successor in Sydney was one of his pupils at one stage in England. So an amazing history there. But anyway, he basically moves out at 41, comes to Australia in 1835 or 6, and from the outset is not just a kind of missionary in the Renaissance, post-Tridentine general mould, kind of let's call it the Ignatian kind of missionary efforts, but certainly more in the mold of the Benedictines, like Saint Boniface or Saint Willibord or Saint who do we have over in Saint Gall in Switzerland. So a number of these amazing saints, and he really did in his preaching and in his missionary and pastoral letters, he speaks about them. He references it all, and he speaks about the ancient world and Christendom. So I think coming to know more about that gave me a great appreciation for not just the tradition and history we had here, but that this first archbishop who was here essentially for 41 years as the archbishop, first of Australia, then he carved out different dioceses. But his entire vision was, we're going to bring the beauties of Christendom, both very much the Western Christendom that he imbibed and lived in, but bring a lot of that as much as possible into an Australian context. And I think we're still unearthing a lot of the beauty that he planted.
You've said that it was 2003 walking the Christus Rex pilgrimage from Ballarat to Bendigo in Victoria that had a profound impact upon you. Could you go into this for us?
Yeah, definitely. The Christus Rex pilgrimage, I think, again, is a kind of something that's copied from the great pilgrimages of old, particularly modelled on the Paris to Chartres pilgrimage in France, which itself is quite an ancient pilgrimage that's been reinvigorated in the last 30 to 40 years. I think for me, starting at the Cathedral Choir in February of 2002, and then going on my first pilgrimage from Ballarat to Bendigo in October of 2003, in a certain sense, the music that I had come to, fairly well know and love by that stage, albeit only 18 months into it, it kind of was an epiphany moment or a mental click moment where, this is how this, early medieval and even arguably prior to that, but early medieval Renaissance tradition of chant and polyphony, this is its original backdrop. This is where it fits into a kind of tapestry that is intricately and organically interwoven, and there was no kind of gaps. There were no awkward pauses or a sense of talking and then singing. And I think for me as a, what was I then, 12-year-old, it was certainly very eye-opening, and I consider that a kind of formative experience over the years.
I've got a couple of Easy questions for you. Usually I leave these kind to the end, but I wanted to get right into them. Who's your favorite sacred music composer and why? And then after that, what's your favorite piece of music, sacred music, and why?
Yeah, easy and hard questions. I feel like I vacillate from time to time. I definitely have a real love and affinity for William Byrd, um, but at the same time, say a more classical composer like Palestrina or Lassus, a more Roman school composers, they also have a real beauty as well. Of late, I've been kind of delving back prior more into the 13 and 1400s, and some of the compositions then are really quite stunning. Um, some of the early Spanish composers, Cristobal de Morales in particular. But I think if I had to answer it very plainly and simply, I think William Byrd would be my favourite, partly because some of his works are kind of insanely intricate, particularly in a rhythmic sense. He was born 1540/1543 and died in 1623. So a really long lifespan, and is certainly at the beginning of the Baroque period. But his music, if anything, it tends to that in some small respects. But if anything, it leans backwards in terms of his inspirations. Um, and a particular piece that I love of his is the Ne Irascaris Domine, which is about 8 minutes. It's in two parts, prima pars and secunda pars. Um, I think originally it's an Advent piece, but it has a very stirring section in it about the desolation of Jerusalem. And as usual with Byrd, it's very busy. It's in five voices, five voices, and the text is very evocative. From Lamentations. And then when it gets to the section, Zion deserta facta est, Zion has been deserted, made deserted, he just goes to very straightforward homophonic chords, and all the intricacy and the rhythmic intricacy just disappears, and it itself, the music itself, is almost deserted at that point. And it's just a very stirring piece of music. Highly recommended. The Voces 8 recording of that, for anyone that's interested.
I'll put a link in the description if people want to check that out. I might even use it as the intro for the video. And would you say that when would you say the golden age of sacred music was? Like, is it when Byrd was around, or was it before or after?
I think, just to cause a little distinction, the golden age, quote unquote, of chant would certainly be older. And when we talk about the earliest of the chant manuscripts that we have today, that are referenced and used for paleographic studies and such, semiological studies, we know, for example, the oldest complete repertoire in semiology, the notation that predates the quadratic square notation that we usually use, comes from the 9th century in St. Gallen Monastery in Switzerland. It's almost beyond doubt that is not the original starting point of that written notation, but it is the earliest that we have. And part of that rationale that it's not the earliest manuscript to be first written is that it is already so intricate and full of detail, both melodically, textually, and in terms of the notation being high or low. It's not exact notation, but it still has references to higher and lower pitches, and also references to quicker and slower passages. So I think if you were to talk about a golden age of chant, it would probably be between the 9th and the 11th century in terms of this codification and written record of what was passed on orally prior to that. And then, of course, with Guido di Arezzo introducing the written notation in not relative notation, but perfect pitch notation. Yeah, so about the year 1050, Guido di Arezzo dies. And I guess from there, you have a kind of slow decline of the chant tradition, in the sense that polyphonic music and organum and harmonized music forms in the church come to the fore. And certainly by the 1500s, with the Medicean gradual and other reforms, the quote-unquote barbaric melismas, so 10, 20, 30 notes being sung on one syllable, they thought that that was all a bit antiquated, so they got rid of them. And then, of course, with the Salem monastery in the 1830s onwards, with their restoration of the chant melodies, there's a resurgence that's kind of reached its zenith with Pope Pius X's encyclical in 1903. So yeah, I'd say a golden age of chant would be anywhere between the 9th and 12th centuries, and that's of course the tradition that the church keeps going back to in terms of a touchstone of the chant received, and then the polyphonic tradition, of course, is kind of immortalized with Palestrina, who starts out as a choir boy and rises up all the way through in Rome itself to become the maestro, the capella of the Sistine Chapel.
So, Ronan, many people seem to think that sacred music is just a decoration to the liturgy. I'm sure you wouldn't agree. Could you kind of just tell us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think there can be a perception of that, particularly in our age, and even in the last few centuries, where the I guess quote unquote luxuries of prior Christian centuries were taken for granted. The idea of having a parish with more than one priest, or a cathedral with a chapter of canons, or a religious house full of monks, brothers or nuns or sisters, and all these people being available both to sing and to serve, make the sung liturgy a ongoing kind of continuous reality in people's experience. But in a post-revolution, post-Reformation age, obviously a lot of these traditions fell by the wayside for the worse. But I guess one of the easiest answers to that is in terms of the document of Pius X in 1903, Trale Sollicitudini, which again is reiterated through the century or through the decades of the last century, and in Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraphs 112 onwards about sacred music, it's made very clear that sacred music forms an integral part of the liturgy. So think about the eggs in the cake as opposed to the icing on top of it, and I think this is just a very philosophical concept that goes right back to ancient times, to the Greek, Roman, Egyptian world, where the idea of worship was always tied in with the idea of song, and that man is a singing being, and that certainly in the Jewish tradition, of course, the Jewish songbook, so to speak, the hymn book is the book of Psalms, and the word psalm itself, psalmos from the Greek, meaning to string a harp. It's all intricately and inherently musical. And even the texts, the texts, if we stop to think for a moment in spoken form, are at the worst absurd and at the least just a little bit bizarre. I will sing a psalm to the Lord, his praise will always be on my lips. And we rattle that off in speech, not picking up on the kind of discord with the text itself. But of course, the church always sees that the bishop saying the Mass in his own cathedral with the complement of clergy and laity and servers and singers, that's the full expression of the liturgy, and then everything from that is a diminution of sorts. And of course, the end point of that diminution is a said liturgy without any song, which of course is still perfectly legitimate and allowed, but it's still very much also certainly acknowledged as a diminution in the liturgical books.
You've already touched on it, but you've said that the church's music has its roots in Second Temple Judaism, which goes way back. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of what we know concretely, or at least as best as we can in terms of painting history and drawing connections, there's almost little doubt that a melody like the tonus peregrinus, from which we now get that tone itself used in the Divine Office, but also where we get the beautiful melody of the Pater Noster, the Our Father, from, that melody itself goes back into the Jewish tradition, and in all the records, it's connected to Psalm 113 in Exitu Israel de Egypto, when the Israelites left Egypt. And there's this beautiful, very stunning psalm painting the picture of coming out of exile into the land of promise, and the provision of food and daily bread. And of course, it made sense that the church in some way adopted that melody as the melody for the Paternoster, which itself is a prayer on our exile to our homeland in heaven and God's provision during this exile. So we know little things like that. There's also a lot of research to point to the fact that the quote unquote Levitical melodies of the Mass, the kind of dialogue melodies, and even in the Dominican liturgy are almost more antiquated in the sense that they go back and forward on a semitone. Dominus vobiscum, and almost sounds Eastern without any comment. And we believe that these Levitical chants go back to the temple. And it's this dialogue between priest and people, or between cantor and choir, and some of the psalms are set up like that. And then I think there's a lot to point to the fact that the Latin Church has received some of its aspects of music from the Greco-Roman tradition, but also obviously from the Jewish tradition. As to exact melodies, there's probably little that we could say with certitude, but I think it's safe to say that there is a singing tradition the entire way through. As Saint Hildegard herself says, her feast day yesterday, that there's this beautiful song of creation, and then Satan tempting Adam and Eve and usurping the hierarchy and order there brings in discord. So this idea of unison and harmony and discord and disharmony is kind of a constant that's been there from the very beginning of creation. So we certainly are recipients of a great tradition, whether we know this or that melody in particular has come from it. I think the principles and the mindset is completely in line with everything back to Miriam on the bank of the Red Sea with a tambourine.
Yeah, on that theme of this kind of symphony of creation, Tolkien in the Silmarillion uses the image of an infinitely beautiful symphony to describe heavenly beatitude. What is it about sacred music that seems to give us a foretaste of heaven?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think ultimately it all ties back into as human beings, as human persons created in God's image and likeness, meaning that we have will and intellect, the ability to know something and to love it as God does. Obviously, the revealed names and revealed concepts of God himself by himself to us is one of the Father eternally speaking his eternal Son and his eternal Word. And again, to borrow from Saint Hildegard, this notion of it with the Holy Spirit, with the Holy Ghost being present, that it's not just a mere speech, as much as we can draw analogy and make these concepts in our own anthropomorphized way. But the idea that God the Father is eternally singing God the Son, so to speak, by way of the breath of the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit. And I guess music being so inherent and integral to the human experience from time immemorial, both written and passed on, there is always a connection with something elevated and something emotional. And I think it's these two notions that elevate us, or at least take us out of the mundane and out of the ordinary and out of the profane, even if it's not necessarily to a religious context, to a divine context. It's at least to something other. It's at least to something else. And that in itself is a kind of prerequisite to the contemplation of heaven, or the idea of heaven, the concept of heaven, is to think otherly. So I think music is the vehicle by which God has designed us to to go out of the body, so to speak. And of course, St. Augustine's analogy of the Trinity being a musical one that, where there are 100 voices, where there are 1,000 voices together in unison, is this perfect parallel with the unity of the three persons of the Trinity. And it doesn't really matter if you have 100 or 500,000. If you think of something like the 1928 Eucharistic Congress in Sydney, with 500,000 people turned out, I'm sure when they sang a resounding Amen back to the Archbishop, that's a very, very powerful and potent concept of unity and unison, religious or not. It's just one of the most powerful realizations of that transcendental.
You've described Psalm 118 as the most amazing feat of poetry in the history of mankind. What's so special about it?
Sounds a bit hyperbolic. I guess in my limited knowledge of sacred scripture, Psalm 118 has always struck me as, and I've used this over the years with students to kind of give them an appreciation for the depth and beauty and profundity of poetry in the Jewish context, and challenge them in many times to try and do one of these themselves, and that is the idea of the Jewish poetic technique of chiasms. That is to say that your first and your last point, when read subsequently, point A and point Z, that they also make sense in that order, and going into a central point, as well as working in the normal fashion, just reading it linearly. And that in itself is quite a kind of mind-boggling concept. But then when you take Psalm 118 as going through each of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and you take Aleph, and you could probably tell us what the last letter is, not that I'm remembering. But if you take the first and last letter of the
My Hebrew is rubbish.
of the Hebrew alphabet, you can read that entire psalm, which is 8 verses per Hebrew letter, Aleph, Bet. If you take these 8 verses, you can read the entire psalm sequentially, or you can read the first letter and then the last, the second letter and then the second last, or you can read the first 8 verses of the first letter sequentially from 1 to 8, or you can read 1 and 8, 2 and 7, 3 and 6, and then 4 and 5 is the point of that little chiasm. And then, so to speak, from the English alphabet, M and N being in the middle of the alphabet, that would be the central point of that entire psalm. So it's kind of doubly chiasmatic, which is completely mind-blowing. And then in the midst of all of that, every single line, every single verse of the 176 verses, 8 times 22, every single verse of that psalm has a word, a synonym connected to the idea of the law, precepts, testimonies, judgments, and that in itself, to not read mechanically but still flow poetically, it's quite astonishing.
Yeah, I love chiasm. That's my big thing. It can be overdone, but when it's there, it's amazing stuff. Spot on.
Sure is.
So, changing tack a little bit, it's occurred to me that many of the traditional and seasonal celebrations that we find in the church originated in the northern hemisphere, and so that they don't really correspond to the seasons, flora, and fauna of the southern hemisphere. And I was wondering, to what extent is that reflected in sacred music? And do you think there's scope for incorporating quintessentially Australian elements into the worship of God?
I think there definitely is scope for that. I dare say that there's still a lot of research and rumination to be done on the topic in a particular context of Australia or New Zealand or anywhere really in the Southern Hemisphere that would, in a sense, have received the Christian faith, at a later date. I guess in terms of sacred music, the feasts and the seasons are set regardless of the parallels of, the kind of spring beauty that comes along with Easter in the northern hemisphere, and when it's a later Easter here, these ideas, which are present but not overwhelmingly so, obviously don't really float. And then the idea of the at least in the religious music, in the devotional and even the secular context of the Christmas feast, the notion of the freezing winter night, it just doesn't come through. And if anything, one might even hope that it was freezing at some midnight masses at 36 degrees or such. But I think there's definitely scope for it. It's just a matter of doing it in an organic way, and in a way that has comprehension and understanding, as opposed to a superficial application of something that, in the end, after 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, might seem to come across as jarring instead of being complementary. Certainly, I think it's much easier to incorporate art in terms of visuals, so painting, sculpting, mosaics. The sacred music tradition in its full right has just been received across the board in the Latin rite, and doesn't really have much room for seasonality or enculturation, in the sense of you have one introit antiphon that you'd sing in one country and it'll be completely different in another. The melody might differ across the European countries historically, but it's not as though there was a different mass formulary for every feast from one country to the next. So I think, in the sense of the kind of lections or the readings and the prayers at a mass, the music stems or flows directly from that. So in that sense, the musical variability isn't really present. But I would say that there's definitely scope and need for incorporating as many, Australian symbols as possible, and certainly one of them would be looking, as you said, the flora and fauna. What plants and animals do we have that we could incorporate symbolism into the liturgy? Here's one little tidbit that's not exactly related, but I learned recently, living approximately 10 minutes up the road from the beautiful Carmelite nuns in Mathaura. A friend of mine said, "Oh, do you know what time they're starting Vespers now?" Because once a month, the local men's scholar sings one side of the Vespers and the nuns sing the other, and it's quite lovely. We do that once a month. I said, "Oh, I thought it was 5:10 every day." And my friend said, "Oh no, they've adapted it to be a little bit more seasonal and a little bit less strict in terms of a time. Let's call it maybe a sundial approach. So instead of having Vespers at 5 p.m., representing the evening, which is what Vespertina means, the evening, at the screeching of the cockatoos flying overhead, returning to their forest trees for the night to go to sleep, one of the sisters will ring the bell, and within 5 minutes they will begin Vespers." So I thought that's absolutely beautiful imagery of incorporating something Australian into, albeit not into the liturgy, but the bell of Vespers at the Carmelite Mathaura Carmel is the screeching of the cockatoos.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that organic sense and the freedom of being God's creature to adapt to the environment and just to make the liturgy and nature sing at the same time. It's how it should be done, I think.
Totally.
So, Ronan, you knew Cardinal Pell. What did you admire about him? And as someone who's familiar with how cathedral services work, what did you make of the accusations that were leveled against him?
Good question. I met the Cardinal in 2003 when I joined the cathedral choir. 2002. And I guess at the time I might have been, for those that knew me then, described as someone who was a little bit hyperactive, bombastic, facetious. A few of these words would fly around. So I guess I was always a little bit more at ease talking to someone of such a high dignity as a cardinal of the Catholic Church, and being a little 10-year-old, you don't really compute that in every context. So I was certainly very familiar from an early age, and I think the cardinal, being of half Irish English descent, probably picked up on the twinkle in my eye and thought, "Oh, there's someone who's very, very full of spirit and will always say what's on his mind." And I think the higher up you go in any chain of any bureaucracy or in the parallel of the church, the less you have people around you that tell you what they actually think. So over the years, our friendship formed, and I guess one strong point that I admired about him was, regardless of what people thought, and whether he himself was right or wrong on a particular topic, be it secular or sacred, he would just speak very frankly and didn't really care for the backlash. Whether it was something in the secular sphere, where the world was jumping on telling him who was right or wrong, or whether it was in the church sphere where people were jumping on telling him he was right or wrong, he would just stick to his guns and he didn't really mind being piled on. So I guess that was good training for what lay ahead in his life. I guess as well, in terms of starting out as a young chorister, he and the chorister manual that I mentioned earlier, the little book that we received when we joined, the Cardinal had a forward in there in which he encouraged us to use our talents that we'd obviously been picked for in terms of musical ability, to praise Almighty God in the liturgical context, and he had signed it in his own pen. So we noticed these little details, and he was very encouraging over the years in terms of how's the cello going, and he'd say, oh yeah, it's not too bad. So very, very encouraging, and I think one aspect that anyone who knew him can relate to is that he would always remember some detail by which he could connect to a person on a personal level. And I think that's a pretty impressive trait and quality for someone who probably interacted with tens of thousands of people over a few decades, or a number of decades. In terms of the accusations, 2016, 17, 18 onwards, from the outset, as you said, coming from a cathedral context, I knew very plainly and very clearly, and said this to anyone who would ask or would listen, anything that anyone does at any stage is between them and God in one sense, and God ultimately knows all that happens and will be the ultimate judge of it, which is both a wonderful and scary thought. But in terms of the allegation put before him, it was very obvious to someone like myself, who had been in that context week in, week out, each Sunday with him in Sydney, that it was just literally and simply and physically impossible. And the idea of having a stage production with, the lead singer or the lead role disappearing for any length of time in itself is absurd. But then to have that lead role disappear from the end of a line, a procession, and little boys at the beginning of that line of procession also disappear, and no one can really bring together any evidence to say that they saw all of this happen. Just bizarre on so many levels, and just impossible. And I guess when the verdict came in from the Victorian court, I think that was quite bewildering for a lot of people, including myself. And I guess by that point, it was very obvious that this was not about George Pell. It was about the figurehead of the, Cardinal figurehead of the Catholic Church in Australia, and by then, obviously, the quote-unquote third in command of the Church, as the Secretariat to the Economy, or Prefect to the Secretary of the Economy. So I think all in all, certainly by the end of it, he was still of good humour and spoke about it as a retreat, which is not something that most people would say after such a kind of abuse committed against them, 440 days. I think he joked at one stage, fit in 10 lengths. So, God bless him for looking on the bright side of it. Obviously, his diaries have come out, and Pope Benedict was reading them before the end of his earthly life as well. And I think there's a lot of, Cardinal Pell's dry wit and humour and strange facts and tidbits in there. But at the same time, there's also very profound and deep insights into how does one suffer properly and how does one offer something up in union with Christ. particularly such a grievance as the entirety of the justice system turning against you. I think it was a real travesty that he was never given, or maybe he applied and wasn't given, but certainly he was never reinstated with his working with children's permit. So he never said a public mass again in Australia, and I think that will always remain as a travesty, even after the full acquittal of 7 High Court judges in the highest justice system in Australia. There's still this mar and this taint to say, yeah, but he's still not really guilt free. So really a dark moment in Australian history, certainly for the justice system. But I think at the same time, a great witness to what Christian suffering looks like, even in the face of such an absurd situation.
Moving on to a slightly happier subject. In 2018, you founded the Jubilate Deo program. Can you tell us what it is and how successful it's been?
Yeah, sure. The Jubilate Deo program started in 2018 informally, and by that I mean that really it was a kind of organic growth in the sense that I was giving a workshop at St. Jerome's Punch Bowl parish in Sydney, at which 2 music teachers attended, one of them from Brigidine College, Randwick. And she said to me afterwards, "Oh, I'd love for some of my a cappella choir students, or possibly year 7 religion students or something, to learn some chant." And I said, always open to doing something new. So she had received a Sydney Catholic Youth grant to put into the religious education for the girls, and basically said, if you come in and teach us something to sing at a end of year mass, I can use that. So we did that. It was hugely successful. We had about 70 girls learn a full Latin communion antiphon, having never looked at chant or probably even heard it before. It was quite a feat to pull off in, I think, about 7 or 8 weeks. And then the response from that antiphon being sung at that mass was almost bizarre. The old Ursuline Brigidine sisters and some of the staff and some of the other students commented on how beautiful it was, even though it was one relatively tiny part of the entirety of that mass. So from there, Anthony Cleary, the director of Mission and Identity at Sydney Catholic Schools, approached me and asked if we could somehow replicate this idea of sacred music being taught to students across the network. And it was from there that we honed in on the 1974, 50th year this year, 1974 document of Paul VI, Jubilate Deo, which was released in 74 for the holy year, the Jubilee year of 75. And that book itself contained about 30 to 40 chants from the Mass and other selection. Another part of the book was a selection of chants, general chants to Our Lady in honor of the Eucharist, etc. So we picked that as a kind of paradigm by which we could, very rightly say in any context that, Sacrosanctum Concilium Vatican II, 1963 said X. On the almost 11th anniversary, the 10th anniversary of that document of the Council, Paul VI releases this document to ask that every Catholic of the Latin Rite know these chants as a core repertoire. And leaving aside the fact that it's been a number of decades and it's still not implemented, let's do it. And of course, a number of the young priests were very engaged across the Archdiocese. So it's grown from 70 girls at Brigidine College in 2018 singing one antiphon. And as of this year, 2024, there are 4 tutors, including myself, teaching in 14 schools across the Archdiocese to almost 1,800 students. Learning a core repertoire of Gregorian chant, and both on the local school parochial level, where these children are putting it into practice almost weekly in some contexts, through to the annual Mass in St. Mary's Cathedral with either Bishop Umbers or the Archbishop Fisher, where you get over 1,000 students gathered together singing some chants from the repertoire that go back to the early Middle Ages. It's really quite a unique program in the sense that it's rolled out across a network as opposed to just being one school or one parish implementing something, which is great and very needed, but also something slightly more macro level where you can roll something out across a wider audience and affect a much quicker cultural change.
Yeah, I imagine that kind of program would be of interest to bishops around the world. Have you received any international feelers, or is it still very much a local program?
Well, it was really only last year that we kind of officially launched it as such with the end of year mass in St Mary's Cathedral with 1,100 students singing the mass with Bishop Umbers, as he likes to call it, the Misselmas. We're just singing what's in the missal, for centuries and centuries. There's really not much to it. There's nothing original about what we're doing. But with the launch of that video and then creating the Jubilate Deo program as its own entity and company to promote the work that we're doing. So there's been one school in Melbourne that's taken it up. There are a couple of schools in Brisbane, Broken Bay and Parramatta Diocese looking at engaging for next year. We've had some interest in Auckland and New Zealand as well. But in terms of marketing or reaching out to various bishops and priests, we haven't really done any of that yet. And I guess there's no real urgency in the sense that we'd love to see the program, even if it doesn't necessarily grow for the next few years, just consolidate and solidify. And that process in itself will reap huge rewards.
So, in the same vein, you're the founding director of Pueri Publications, which publishes books to help children learn sacred chant. Can you tell us how they work? Because they're not simply books. And do you have any new publications planned?
Yeah. So Pueri Publications, that kind of initiative grew out of my time teaching in a school, teaching music in a school up in Brisbane. And there was one particular year 3 student. At the end of each term, I would get all the students, certainly in the primary school and sometimes in the high school context, to perform. And part of the rationale of this was that music, at least in the choral context, is a team sport. Everyone is inherently musical, at least rhythmically. We all have a heartbeat, as I like to joke with the students. If you don't have that, you won't be here next week. So there was one student in year 3, 2017, who came in and did their end of term performance, and she had a little cardboard book with an electronic keyboard attached, and it was full of Christmas carols. And I'd probably seen these type of books, Big W, Kmart, wherever else before that Target, but it never struck me as something that was of relative importance. And then I asked this little girl at the time, Jane. I said, "Oh, can I have a look at the book, please?" And I was looking through it, and I thought, okay, this is the perfect model, or the perfect resource for children to have an introduction to sacred music without the necessity of an adult being present, a master or a teacher or a parent knowing what they're doing, which of course is not ideal, but it is a stepping stone and a gap filler where that isn't possible. So it only took me 4 years to go from that conceptualization, looking at a Christmas Carol equivalent book and going through various stages and hoops and finding a designer, a graphics artist, a priest friend of mine in the UK to do the beautiful drawings, to find a graphics artist and colorer here to do all the works. I've had a few friends, one in Queensland, one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, help me with those colorizations over the years. And then went through 3 different prototypes with a company in China just to actually get the book physically. First 2 didn't like them, so we went through various stages to get it right. So the current Children's First Chants, Simple Prayers, is a book of 12 chants, some from the Mass and some, Grace Before Meals, the Glory Be to the Father, the Pater Noster, the Sub Tuum, Prayer to Our Lady. And each note of the Gregorian chant has a color behind it. So you have your normal square black note, and behind it will be a color that coordinates to the keys on the keyboard. And it's a little over a year and a half since I printed a print run of 3,000, and we've moved on, I think, about 2,700, 2,800 of them now. So that's really exciting. I have almost completed a second volume, which in a sense will be a preliminary volume. So that first book is pitched at 7-year-olds and plus, and this next book is pitched at 4-year-olds and plus, and it's much simpler in the sense that it hones in on the scales of the chant, so the 8 different modes and scales, or as they're described in the book, the staircases. So it's introducing them to the soundscape of chant, so that when they then go to pieces of music, this music style and genre that is neither major nor minor, close in some respects, but it's not a major minor paradigm. They'll already have a kind of taste and an ear for that. So we're hoping to get stock for that in December, January this year, next year.
Despite being in the Campion College Scholar, I encountered the word solfège, which is the do re mi, right?
Yep.
It's that kind of ascending note scale or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's in your children's first chance, but it has a Christian backstory. So I was hoping you could just fill us in on that.
It sure does. It's. I was a bit late to the party too, in terms of going through the entire cathedral experience and learning and immersion. And I knew of Do Re Mi, but didn't know anything about its history and its phenomenal beauty. Solfege, coming from the Italian solfeggio, which comes from the Latin sol, fa, so the 2 inner notes of the scale. And the long story short is that a hymn of St. John the Baptist, which goes back to probably the 7th or 8th century, at least textually, written by Paul the Deacon. I'm sure there's been a few of Paul the Deacons, but it's ascribed to Paul the Deacon. Each note of each phrase steps up by a tone or a semitone as to what we now know as the major scale or the diatonic scale. So I'll just sing the first verse, and I'll hover on each note that we now name the solfege, the do re mi. Utque ant laxis resonare fibris mira gestorum famulitorum solve polluti labireatum Sancte Ioannes. So there's obviously some differences. The first word is ut, and people think, well, that's not do. So over the centuries, that changed to do, either being the first syllable of the last name the last name of the man who changed it in Italian, or I like to say it's the first syllable of Dominus, the very obvious Latin word of the Lord. So every time we sing do, it's a contraction. Either the man's last name who changed it was also, I think, Dominici or something. So we're either saying in a contracted form, the Lord, or Saint Dominic, or something to that effect. So still very, very, very much Christian. But this hymn of the Vespers feast of Saint John the Baptist, for the Vespers of the feast of Saint John the Baptist, Guido di Arezzo, Guido the monk, who died in 1050. It's the millennial anniversary next year of his beginning of teaching the children of the boys' choir of Arezzo Cathedral, north of Rome, near Florence. And he employed this technique. And in one of his famous books, he says that I've turned the role of cantor taking 10 years and to becoming a cantor in 3 years, because we can write it down and we can reference exact pitches from this scale. So really a phenomenal turning point in music history, in Western musical notation. And then the last scale in the last degree in the scale, T, which still in the French school is C, is a little contraction of Sancte Ioannes. Sancte Ioannes, St. John, S-I-S-J. So every time we say T, C, we're invoking the wonderful Baptist. So much history in that tiny little, scale that we use across the board in different schools, conservatoire. It's quite amazing, that history, and it's relatively buried. Another piece I would highly commend to people to listen to is the Ut Queant Laxis by Orlando de Lasso, or Orlando de Lassus. A really stunning setting where the tenor sings Ut, and then the rest of the parts break out into 5-part, 4-part harmony with the other text, and then the tenor comes back in Re, and then the choir goes off again. really gorgeous piece. But it's kind of fun in that it showcases here's the scales and the steps of the scale, the degrees of the scale, but it gives the full sense of that hymn and the text around it.
So, besides buying your books, what can parents who have no musical training do to foster musicality in their children?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely a few things. One I would say is the Latin word for mouth is ore, and the Latin word for prayer is ora. And I think getting your children engaged in anything to do with orational skills, speech skills, storytelling skills, reading skills, using your tongue, using your mouth, your lips, your teeth, uh, it's just invaluable at a young age. And if you can create this love for articulation and diction and pronunciation, it just goes on, as in the classical paradigm, from the grammar phase and opens up the entire world before you. Not to mention confidence, which is such a kind of stopping point for most people in a musical journey that they might have or might have had. So I would definitely encourage any parent, if you can't sing, quote unquote, which you can, if you can't sing, you can speak, or you can at least get some amount of eloquence and beautiful speech patterns coming out of your children. And we live in such a blessed age in one sense with technology to have at our fingertips this simulation of beautiful music and beautiful oration. So to immerse your child in those experiences, primarily real, tangible, physical ones, and not virtual. But when we don't have that afforded to us, the virtual is really great. So there's really no excuse, I think, to create a musical adults of the next generation. And I would challenge any parent that if you get the appetite and the love of music correct and ordered and right in your child, the rest will flow on from that. And that's not just a biased statement of a musician and music teacher, but I think if you delve back into the ancient wisdom of certainly the Greeks, and Plato in particular, the impact of music, both in its specific instrumental sound ratio sense, but also in its broader orderly sense of the muses of the ancient world and the order they instill and impart into all the facets of thought and of learning. If you instill that love of beauty and order in your child, particularly through the most inherent musical form, which is within us, rhythm and pitch, you really cannot equip them better in life.
Some of those people watching will come from your regular Catholic parish, in which it's a good chance that the music might be dreadful, because it's often pitched too high for men to sing, even if they wanted to. So I was wondering, what steps could a parish take so that men will not only be able to sing but will want to sing?
Great question. The kind of brutal short answer is this: if the priest wants something better, something more sacred, something more beautiful, it will happen. If he doesn't, it won't happen. And I guess in an age of mediocrity, um, one needs to make hard decisions. And if that means parish hopping for a bit and then moving to a different parish to your geographic one, in order to find more beauty and more transcendence, uh, yes, it's a hard and sad decision, but it has to be made. And the inherent Catholic, position and ingrained the Catholic DNA is to be parochial and geographic and incarnational and localized. But it's not always afforded to us to have that luxury, and that normal state of affairs. If the priest is in search of more beauty and wants to do that which is sacred, in distinction to that which is profane, from the Latin profanum, meaning outside of the temple, if he wants to keep that notion of sacrality and beauty and etherealness alive, he will always find people to aid and abet him in that process. As I've heard said a couple of times, there's nothing special in the water in Westminster. The boys that turn out each year for the scholarship program in one of the most amazing cathedrals on the planet, yes, they have excellent talent, but they didn't drink anything special. They didn't eat a particular diet to turn out like that. There is general musicianship and musical talent around everywhere. It's just like anything else in life. If it's not tapped into and harnessed and cultivated, mediocrity, as usual, will prevail.
Finally, Ronan, what's a way, well, I suppose, besides buying your books, is there any way that people can support you or follow your work?
In terms of the Jubilar Tadeo program, I think we have a new website which we're continuing to expand, and a Facebook page, an Instagram page for those that want to follow what we're doing. It's very exciting work being on the ground with the next generation from year 3 level up to year 12. We're also doing work in different parishes and communities, doing work with young adults, particularly in Sydney. We have a weekly session at St John's College University, and that's just a stunning backdrop for the musical setting that we're learning. So there's exciting things happening there, and I think at least by way of people looking for resources of what they can implement in a parish or in a young adult setting or in a school, be it 101, 102, feel free to reach out to the Jubilar Tadeo program, and we can help in that regard. In terms of the Pueri Publications initiative, I would highly recommend any parent wanting to delve further into that for their child. I'm currently working on a tutor parent handbook complement to the 2 Children's First Chants volumes, both Simple Prayers and Learning to Sing. And that's going to help equip parents and teachers to deliver something in a fuller way, with far more intellectual content that they can deliver appropriately to the child as they see fit. And yeah, I guess I would also challenge and use a funny kind of quote from another friend who said, "Children's First Chance, you should just publish the same book and change the cover to Adults' Last Chance." That there is really no age that is too late for an adult to start to delve into it. And I love having the case of year 7s, year 8s, so these kind of awkward-aged, which we all go through, awkward-aged school children. Oh, I can't sing. Particularly prevalent, I think, in Australia, where we are fairly amusical as a culture. And I say, that's fine. Okay, just can you say the word dough? Of course, we've already had a conversation, so they can't say no, so they say dough. And then I go up to the board and, almost annoyingly write out 15 O's after it. Okay, can you now say that word? And they kind of roll their eyes and look at me like, seriously? And I'm like, yeah, come on, give it a try. And they go, dough. Perfect. You're just saying dough. It was very low, but you sang it. Well done. So I think challenging people to just be uncomfortable, again, to hopefully not become too brutal or uncharitable. Understand that in human history, you sit outside of the norm. It's a slight glitch of the human experience to be amusical. You can rectify it. If you have breath, you can rectify it. So I would just encourage and challenge everyone of any age to try and pick it up. There are awesome websites and apps out there. Square Notes app, it's a wonderful resource. You can pick your pitch, pick your pace, touch the note, and it'll play it to you for any number of Gregorian chants. So there's really no excuse in this age where we don't need to rely on the Carolingian cantors of Stephen II, coming up from Rome to the great empire to spread the chant, and that takes many years of process. We can literally hop onto YouTube and within 20 seconds be hearing something that took other generations many years to learn.
Very good. We'll put a number of those important links in the description so you can check it out that way. Also, if you could like, share, and subscribe to the Thomas More Centre channel, we'd really appreciate it. Ronan Reilly in Sydney, Australia, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mark. God bless.